I want to introduce Christopher Barth, who's been part of the cadre here since the beginning. He taught the lead of yesterday's course. Sarah Saarloos taught the middle section, and her camera will pop on here. And she's been part of the cadre since the beginning. Holly Craik, who is the program director. She introduced the very first class last Wednesday on the 17th, our supply and demand. And so Holly is behind the scenes also helping out. That's our cadre. Now that it's high noon, we're going to go ahead and introduce Jim Whittington. Jim is known to many people. We always considered him one of our guru mentors who helps us through tough situations, stressful situations, and he's the perfect subject matter expert.
This is the fourth class in a series of just-in-time trainings developed for the public affairs and PIO communities in the Northwest. My name is Jim Whittington. I'm a member of the cadre that's been working for the last few weeks to develop this training series. I was once a PIO on the PNW2 incident management team, and I am a retired public affairs specialist from the Bureau of Land Management's Medford district. As Kale mentioned, joining today is Sarah Saarloos and Chris Barth, who are working behind the scenes. Chris will be the official slide flipper today, and Kale is doing all the good Kale things that he usually does. Next slide, please, Chris. So again, this is the fourth in a series. We have the simulation coming up next week. We're working hard to figure out how we're going to create a good scenario that will be both challenging to PIOs and PAOs, as well as help people line out some processes and some ways of thinking and gathering information and sharing information during this really unprecedented time. Next slide, please. So meeting etiquette, want to cover a few requests from the cadre. We ask that you keep your camera off and mute your microphone during the class. Use the chat box if you have a question. Instructors will answer questions at the end of each section. And we'll also hit on the raised hands for folks to ask questions during that time as well. And then additionally, some of the questions may be answered in the chat. Next slide. For the agenda, we're going to look at a few things. I wanted to spend some time talking about stress and kind of our normal stress, and then the additional stress that COVID-19 presents, and then the different kinds of stresses that an incident within an incident presents. Then we'll go through some planning and staffing questions, some sense making, talk about some communication, watch out situations, and then get into some COVID-19 scenarios and maybe some discussion on that front. So next slide. So informal NWCG training, incident within an incident, is often meant to include a whole bunch of things like presidential visits, evacuations, all that kind of stuff. For the most part, in this presentation, we're going to be using incident within an incident to mean serious injury or fatality, which is the way most of us think about it in the fire world, at least. The thing to remember about this year is that COVID-19 changes things. If you think of COVID-19 as the society-wide incident, our fires are no longer standalone. They are the incident within the larger COVID-19 incident. And then the incident within the incident that we're used to talking about now becomes an incident within an incident within an incident. And it's a profound change. And I think many folks, including media and elected officials, are already viewing the 2020 fire year through that lens. So that creates several issues for us. I think as experts in wildfire, or agency experts as PAOs are, we should always be careful not to trade on that expertise as a source of credibility for opinions that aren't grounded in our world. Maintaining standing and credibility will be a challenge this year, and the public will be less likely to defer to our expertise where COVID-19 is concerned, and we should not ask them to. Trust and credibility are gained through actions. In the fire world, we've built that trust and credibility over many tough incidents and many tough years, and we can't afford to buy credibility on other topics with that currency. So that's not to say we don't address COVID-19. That's not to say it's not going to be a focus, but let's be careful and keep a line between our reputation and our credibility on fires versus COVID-19. And when we're talking about COVID-19, we have it's really going to increase the importance of how we communicate with each other, particularly between PIOs and PAOs. If we have a COVID-19 incident that affects firefighters or fire personnel, the lines between public affairs and PIOs will not necessarily be as sharp as they have been in the past. There's always a little bit of a tension between PIOs and PAOs because they're fundamentally different jobs. And put very simply, the public affairs person is concerned with the reputation of the large organization, and the public information officer is concerned with the people affected by the incident. That's not a disparaging comment towards either one. Both of those missions are incredibly important, and PIOs need to remember that the agency will be there long after the incident is done. I just bring up this thing because so you can recognize it and deal with it if you encounter that dynamic, as well as make the effort to communicate better by recognizing those differences. So COVID-19 not only adds to our communication complexity and our logistical complexity, but again, we have to depend on both PAOs and PIOs to develop an inclusive incident common operating picture that allows us all to understand the social and political context of any particular time and place. All of this obviously adds stress even without an incident within an incident within an incident. Next slide. Now, with COVID-19, we're also part of that incident, just as a homeowner would be part of a wildfire incident. Any one of us can get sick, have friends and loved ones who test positive, or otherwise be affected in some way by the virus. This creates an additional stress we haven't had to deal with before. I did a few weeks ago, I did a stint in the Emergency Operations Center in Washington State. And it was quite different because you're always thinking about COVID-19 in the back of your head. What if I'm asymptomatic and spreading it to my coworkers? What if a family member gets sick while I'm here? What if I have to isolate or get hospitalized this far away from my family? The questions are endless and constant. And in talking with other folks who were working at the same time, they were having very similar questions. And so as a PIO in particular, we're used to going somewhere, leaving the home unit, going somewhere to a fire, not having to worry about that home unit, checking in with the family, maybe through a couple of texts during the day and a quick phone call right before we sack out. But that's not going to be the norm this year. You're going to have that constant little voice in your head that keeps bringing up these questions and these concerns. And so be aware of that and recognize that other people are always going to be feeling something similar. And so that stress level and the communication and the interaction between people may be affected by that. But try not to let that particular stress be debilitating. Good stress is called eustress, EU stress, and can encourage you to act. And that includes reminding yourself to wash your hands regularly, wipe down your work surfaces, maintain that 6 feet distance, wear a mask, give yourself a little more downtime to better manage your fatigue, more frequent check-ins on the home front. All those things that you do to take care of yourself and lower your risk if you accept that little voice in the back of your head as a warning and a reminder. Next slide. So stress is a pretty amazing kind of thing. It's immediate and it's cumulative. It's personal and it's organizational. As part of an organization, you can feel the stress that the organization creates. And as PAOs and PIOs, a big part of our job is communicating while under stress to people who are also under stress. In fact, you can't have a conversation on an incident without talking to somebody under some kind of stress by that incident. When you add an additional stressor like an incident within an incident, a critical incident, a special situation, or other words, it can get tough quickly. So my first piece of advice is to be honest with yourself and your capacity at that time. You may not be in the right frame of mind to deal with a fatality, with a serious accident. There's no shame in recognizing that and no honor in pushing through when you recognize you probably should not. And it could be anything. You could have a grandmother that's ill. You could have a pet that just died. You could have, one of your kids may have an illness. It doesn't matter, and it shouldn't matter. And nobody should judge you. If you're not in the right spot, then be honest with yourself. Let your supervisor know, and disengage. We have too few good PIOs and PAOs to burn people out needlessly. And again, if you need to disengage, that's okay. Maybe the next time, and there will always be a next time, you'll be in a place where you can engage and allow someone else the grace of taking care of themselves. So in addition to being honest with yourself, be forgiving with the people you supervise, and be honest with your supervisor or your incident commander. And then if you decide to stick it out for that incident within an incident, keep in mind that fatalities have a much different vibe than regular incidents. On a regular fire, as if there is such a thing, you have a battle rhythm set by the meetings, the planning meetings, C&G meetings. The work is there. You start chinking away at the chaos, bringing a little bit of order wherever you can. On fatalities, once a fatality happens, you can't always just go get it done. You often must wait for families and others to get to the point where they recognize they need the help that you can bring. If you're waiting, you can still plan, and sometimes being present is better than acting. It's sort of like jazz. Sometimes the best notes in jazz are the ones that aren't played. So be cognizant of that. And I've seen people get really frustrated because they can't go and get things done, but the time isn't right. You have to let the family, for the most part, set the timetable, and that's okay. And then don't forget the after part. Take care of yourself and others. A little story on myself. A few years ago, a helicopter went down in Northern California. 9 people died. Several others were injured and hospitalized. And a number of those who died were from a contract crew in the Medford area. And so we had a memorial service. This was the Iron 44 incident. A memorial service here, and went through a number of tough deals to finally take care of the families and get the memorial service taken care of. And at the end, I had the opportunity to go do a little counseling session, a little critical stress debrief. And I chose not to because I thought, hey, I'm strong, I'm good, it's no big deal. A few weeks later, I was coming back from a meeting, and there was a bag of laundry on my desk. One of the kids that had died in the helicopter crash had dropped his laundry off at the fire and never come back to pick it up. And so I had to figure out how to get it to the family. And that really hit me in a way that being in the immediate part of the action of, working through the memorial service and dealing with the families and all that other stuff did not. And so for probably 3 or 4 months after that, I was not a very good public affairs person. I would sit there and get requests to write things like, hey, do a press release for Free Fishing Day. And I'd be like, Free Fishing Day? Who cares about that? That's not important. Finally, when I realized that it was also affecting my home life, I pulled myself out of it and started getting some help and thinking about it. And that set me up and put me in a much better place to deal with some other fatalities, including Yarnell, which was particularly rough too. So my advice to you is there's no shame in getting help. Please do it. Again, we can't afford to burn people out. We can't afford to have people drop out because they don't want to go through this. So take care of yourself and take advantage of every opportunity you have to get help. Next slide. So planning and staffing. If you have a bad day on your incident or unit, the immediate response is to think you can handle it just fine. Particularly if you're a public affairs officer, this will be supported by the organization's reaction, which will almost certainly be initially a circling of the wagons or a let's take care of our own approach. But don't trust that feeling. Validate it, consider the larger picture, check your plans. Inevitably, you'll come to recognize you need help. And then, ask for help before you feel overwhelmed. It's like water in the desert. By the time you realize you're thirsty, you're well behind the curve. Consider the type of assistance you'll need and what kind of experience and qualifications will help. If you can, lay the groundwork now by identifying resources and training them up before anything happens. Involve your leadership so they know how your plans will fit with the whole. Remember, the incident is still ongoing and the agency is still running. On incidents, we look at dividing the incident within the incident, the critical incident, and the regular incident duties, and PAOs should consider a similar approach if you can. The object of planning is not to cover every contingency perfectly so you can just apply your plan and call it good. It never works that way. The object of planning is to understand the complexity and prioritize the things you'll need to do. It gives you slides in your head about what's important, and it reminds you of things you would otherwise overlook. Also, plan's not like a volume on a shelf. It can be as simple as a bullet list scratched on a paper or a few things in your head. Don't overcomplicate planning. Like Ike says, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. The very definition of emergency is that it's unexpected. Therefore, it is not going to happen the way you're planning. The goal of planning is to get to the point where the stress you experience on an incident or an incident within an incident, or now an incident within an incident within an incident, will be confined mostly to that event itself and not how you'll manage the incident within the incident, including your team processes like gathering and sharing information for that common operating picture and making and communicating decisions. That goes for PAOs and PIOs both. So again, test and validate your current plans. If you have plans on the shelf, make sure they're current. Make sure the right phone numbers and contacts and names and all of that good stuff is in there. Make sure they're aligned with other parts of your organization. Consider the possibilities of when you might use that plan. Identify those resources and skills. Train those resources as best you can. Test them. Give them scenarios. Work through problems. Work on all your processes, your information sharing processes, your decision-making processes, all that stuff. Involve leadership, again, to make sure that you're aligned with the rest of the organization. And as we mentioned before, the agency in the incident won't stop just because something bad happens on it. So keep that in mind and be prepared to figure out how you're going to deal with both aspects of that.
I see a hand up, Patrick Taylor, my friend. How are you?
Good. Glad to be with you all today. My question, and I realize you might not be an expert in this, but most of the time when we're dealing with things, as you mentioned, there's stress. So I've always struggled for myself and for others knowing when are things just hard and stressful versus when do I or others need help. So do you have any kind of suggestions on indicators or things like that we can look for?
Yeah, I think one of the big indicators is people getting grumpy. And so if you see that, then that's a pretty big sign. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got about working on incidents is that it doesn't matter who you are, how much experience you have, sometime between day 4 and day 6, you're going to hit a wall and you're going to put your cranky pants on and you're not going to be a pleasant person to be around. And the real skill in that is anticipating it, doing what you can to mitigate that, like taking more frequent breaks, getting some downtime, managing that fatigue level so that when that wall comes, it's not so high and so wide, and it doesn't last as long. So once you recover from that little period, you're pretty much on maintain mode and can manage for the rest of the incident. But we get adrenaline pumping the first few days. You get called out, your adrenaline starts pumping. First few days, there's a lot of things going on. You're trying to figure it all out, and it's really critical to take care of yourselves at that point. Whether you're a PIO coming in on a new team, whether you're a PAO who just had an incident start on their unit, or whether you're a PIO coming into a fire in the middle of a 4 or 5 week period where that fire is having teams on it. So just watch out for that day 4 to 6. Do your best to know that it's coming and manage for it. And I think that goes a long ways, at least on the incident, towards figuring that out. And then, there are questions. I'm a real big believer in if you can identify your stress, it's much easier to deal with, which is why I went into a little bit of detail here about stress. So if you're feeling stressed, don't let it be that kind of amorphous, undefinable stress that's you're carrying around with you all the time. Try to figure it out and put a name on it and figure out how you're going to deal with that certain piece of it. And then that helps in the long run too.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. Thank you, Jim. We have 2 more hands up for this session. Marlita Reddy-Emfeld, your hand is up.
Hi, Jim.
Hey.
I'm wondering if, well, I've been thinking about stress and the virtual world and this. I know you haven't been on an incident yet in this arena with teams, but we've all been through quarantine having to deal with people on Zoom or whatever other, or Skype or whatever. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, to me, the biggest part of dealing with a situation like this is to be able to communicate with your team members. And so I'm looking for your thoughts on how to deal with this situation in the virtual environment.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is COVID-19 changes all of our processes, right? Pretty much everything that we've developed over the decades to make our ability to respond to fires and in the information world to deliver information was geared towards efficiency and not having to think through everything all the time. Now, with COVID-19, all our processes are changing. We're having to do more virtual stuff. We're having to do all of these things like we're seeing here in this meeting. And that creates a level of stress until we get to the point where we have enough slides in our head to where we don't have to think about it. So I anticipate that our stress levels just from being PIOs and having to go through all the new stuff that we're having to go through will be higher at the beginning of the season. And I think by the end of the season, by the end of the fire year, we'll be in a much better place because we will have dealt with some of this stuff more than once and start getting some experience with it. The other issue is communicating and working remotely or virtually. And how do you, as maybe a lead PIO, assert leadership over a person where you can't really read their body language, where you can't put a hand on their shoulder and say, hey, what's up? That is going to be difficult, and that's going to create some stress. So I think it creates a greater emphasis on what I was just talking about a little while ago, not just with incident within an incident, but for every time we're working with somebody this year is to be honest with ourselves and be honest with the person we're working with about how that communication is going. So, it sounds weird because we're communicators, but we're going to have to communicate a heck of a lot better this year and make sure everything's nailed down and make sure we're not assuming that somebody's saying something just because we heard it a certain way. We have to validate that and check it. And it's going to take some energy, some mental energy. And so that leads to mental fatigue. And that means that we're going to have to take care of ourselves a little bit differently and a little bit better than we have in the past.
Okay, Suzanne, do you still have your hand up?
I just wanted to add a couple things and to what some things that Jim has said and some of the questions. So have a buddy. Jim and I were able to do that together, and really the only reason I think we made it through on that incident. So I think even in the virtual world, have a buddy to stay connected with who is one of the other PIOs in the incident. Check in with each other on a regular basis. Super important. The other thing I wanted to bring up, something that Jim talked about as well, with the tension that sometimes is between PAOs and PIOs. It's a thing, it's real, but I would ask that this year, more than ever, we really work to try to have a closer relationship, especially with COVID and it being a very political year. So just making that connection early and often between PAOs and PIOs is going to be vital this year. And that's all I wanted to add. Thanks for doing this, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Suzanne, for supporting us all.
Okay, so I want to spend a little bit of time talking specifically to public affairs folks out there. Part of the appeal of the job of public affairs is never knowing what you might be dealing with when you show up for work in the morning. But you also have to understand and represent the entire organization. So that's kind of fun too. But unfortunately, at some point, part of that world will include critical incidents. And it's not just fires we're talking about, line of duty deaths to regular employees, suicides, off-premise deaths, workplace accidents. And you can even get into some really weird stuff like, in my experience, I've had to deal with employees taking kickbacks on contracts. Had a person who went on a crime spree pretty soon after they just left the agency, and that became kind of a national story. And there are also things like illegal occupation of federal lands, but that's a whole other story. So always be prepared to go into this kind of mode. In my career, I've had to deal with 2 line of duty deaths that were non-fire related. And those are quite a bit different than the fire ones, because you often don't have the support of an incident management team or the full fire organization support when you're dealing with those. So some of that may fall to you. Now, if you are working for a good manager, the first thing they're going to do is pull the Agency Administrator's Guide to Critical Incidents off of the shelf. And if you're working for a bad manager, the first thing they're going to do is call a good manager who's going to tell them to pull the Agency Administrator's Guide to Critical Incidents off the shelf. So make sure you are familiar with that document. Make sure you understand what's in it, what your responsibilities are, and make sure it's validated and updated. Look at local hospitals, local burn units. Make sure you have contacts for the hospital public affairs person. Make sure if there's a hospital or chance of something going down in a town that's several hours drive time away, that you can contact somebody from your agency or another agency that can help you out if you need immediate assistance. There's all kinds of things to work through in there. And again, go through it with your manager, go through it with your leadership team, and make sure everybody's aligned, and validate and update. In a bit, we'll look at COVID-19 scenarios, but as you go through the Agency Administrator's Guide, you can look at it wearing glasses for both traditional incident within an incidents that would take place on like a timber sale or a fire, and then also apply that COVID-19 lens to it as well. If you have a bad day, you immediately start to think short and long term. The short term is that immediate response, families, media, elected officials, public, the immediate stuff that's going to happen. And then there are going to be things that happen in the near term, like investigations and memorial services, staff and self-care. Particularly for that one, get your leadership involved now. Have them walking around. If something happens and they walk into a room trying to be sympathetic and do the things that leaders are supposed to do without ever being in that room before, it won't go well. In a high-risk organization, leadership has to be present, and it gives them credibility on those bad days. One of the line of duty deaths I worked on was a fatality where a BLM employee was driving through a timber sale, and a tree was cut and fell on her vehicle. And one of the things that came out during the process of going through stress debriefings and other things is that there'd been a suicide previously, a suicide that had happened away from work, at home. And as such, there was nobody that really addressed that. Nobody really talked about it. And there was some residual stress and angst from that, and from the fact that leadership did not address it at that time. So, be careful and pay attention to all those things, and make sure that you are connecting with employees, again, because if you're not, and then you try to go in and be sympathetic and be supportive, there may be some pushback on that, and that's what we don't want and we don't need. Reports and findings. Investigations lead to reports, and sometimes there may be several investigations and several investigative reports, and they may not all agree. So as a PAO, you may have to figure out how to navigate between those different things. You may have to figure out how to phrase things for immediate release, or how to talk to families about these kinds of things. You may even be asked to help develop a response or help with the release of a report. That happened to me on one of the findings on a fatality that we had on the Big Windy fire, where we had a water tender rollover. The report came out on the configuration of the water tender and recommendations for improved standards for water tenders. And so for some reason, I got selected to help work on that. So you might find yourself doing those kinds of things. There'll be legal actions. So make sure you and your team manage your documents appropriately and understand that the future FOIA burden may be significant. Family needs. We're doing a much better job of identifying family liaisons. In the past, what happened was when something would happen to somebody, and we would look around and say, hey, that person seems like they'd be a good family liaison. Let's let them do it. But never really considering that the ask may be too much for that person, or maybe, again, they may not be in the right spot to do that kind of work at the time. So I think we've done better at training and identifying family liaisons. And as a PAO, you want some influence over that if you can, because a part of the family liaison's job is to carefully explain what the agency can and can't do. And it's easy for family liaisons to overpromise in an emotional moment. And if that happens, then as a public affairs person, you may be cleaning up some of that, and it can get messy really fast. And know that family contacts may go on for years. It's not unusual for family liaisons to stay in touch with folks for, 5-10 years after the event. Anniversaries are always tough. You should have a good idea as to what level of interest it will garner. If it's going to be something significant, you should probably overplan for the first year anniversary, and then use your best judgment on the later ones. First anniversaries are hard to figure out sometimes, and as you go forward from there, it becomes a little bit easier. All right, we'll go to the next slide. PIO planning and staffing. Most incident management teams have incident within an incident plan and COVID-19 plans. And so I think it's important this year for particularly lead PIOs to not keep those under wraps. When you show up on an incident, get together with that agency public affairs person and share that plan. Make sure they know where they fit and where you fit and what you think your responsibilities are, and get some buy-in and make sure that everybody agrees that that's the process that you're going to work. Pulling it out at the moment after something happens is probably not the best practice. You want to evaluate your staff and develop a staffing plan for an incident within an incident. And when it occurs, you implement your plan, you assess the situation, and you order additional help if needed, and it probably will. Consider investigations and memorial services. What kind of support will you be asked to provide to those folks? Make sure you have a solid transition between teams or back to the unit to make sure that, again, all that documentation, all the work that you've been doing is reflected in that transition. Social media is a really tough one on fatalities and serious injuries on fires. We have a notification system that was developed in the early to mid 20th century, and it just doesn't work anymore with social media. On Big Windy, where we had the rollover of the water tender, it was a 19-year-old kid on his first fire. And it happened as the night shift was coming down off the mountain. Within a few minutes, we had things figured out in the PIO shop. We had a release drafted. We had some language put together. we were all set, ready to go. We followed our processes. We set our staffing and let everybody know what was going on. And then things stopped because the sheriff was the one that would make the notification. The sheriff was the one that would make the public announcement. And the sheriff wanted to investigate the scene personally. And so from 8 a.m. till 4 p.m. about, we were in limbo waiting for the sheriff to do something. So that creates some huge concerns. For instance, we had newspapers calling funeral homes trying to figure out the information because we could not release information about that. So one of the lessons we learned from that is get with your liaison officer and get together with local law enforcement and now public health, your public affairs officer, your agency administrator, and figure out how you're going to release information for a fatality, a serious accident, or a COVID incident, and make sure that everything's aligned. Because, if you treat if you treat a notification from something that happens on a fire where there are 1,500 people, the same as you treat a notification from a car accident where there's one family, it just doesn't work. People will hear about it, and everybody who has a loved one on that fire is going to be calling. And it creates a lot of uncertainty and a lot of angst and makes it really difficult on the public information shop and the public affairs folks at the unit that it happened on. So do your best to iron all those things out. Next slide. Smoke is going to be key this year. I think we're going to have a broader and more intense interest for smoke than we're used to, even given the recent years of lengthy smoke impacts and smoke events in the Northwest. And a big part of that is that there've been, there's two tracks of studies, right? There's the studies that the fire community's been doing about smoke exposure on wildland firefighters. And we find that that smoke exposure probably leads to potential for long-term health effects, including heart disease and respiratory illnesses. Then there are studies done around the globe about elements in air pollution that enhance the transmissibility or symptoms of COVID-19. And some of those things are found in wildland fire smoke. So that creates a situation where we probably really need to start changing our tactics to try to limit the amount of smoke exposure firefighters have when they're working directly on the line, because that's where they get the most smoke. Anyway, we need to do that anyway. And now with COVID-19, we really need to think hard about it. And so if IMTs and operations folks design their strategy and their tactics to try to limit firefighter smoke exposure on the line, that means that we may have situations where we're not as aggressive in our suppression actions as we were before, where we have fires that put up smoke longer than they would have potentially. So that may create a catch-22 situation where we're limiting smoke to firefighters, but we're exposing communities to more smoke longer. So the smoke thing is going to be a tough deal. I don't know that there's any good solution to it, but it's going to take a lot of communication. And what we don't want is a lot of antagonism on the part of the public, thinking that they're breathing smoke because we're protecting ourselves. So it's going to be a tough communications haul there. So I think it's important that public affairs officers get with their leadership and, again, start talking to local elected officials, public health officials, so you can plan right now how you're going to help vulnerable populations this year in your communities, and let those folks know the pressures that fire officials are going to be under during a COVID-19 year. And, we will have smoke monitors this year. They will be in high demand, however. So you may have to depend on your state smoke folks or your local National Weather Service office to be your best source for smoke effects in a particular area. Next slide. All right, so sense making. I've been using the word staffing to actually mean a lot of things, including how you'll evaluate the situation strategically. So let's look at some of those factors that will influence the level of your response. First one there is scale. Now, if you look at 2 incidents that I've been on, one was Big Windy, where we had the one water tender rollover. Another one was Yarnell, where, of course, the Granite Mountain hotshots, 19 died. And in a sense, Yarnell was easier to find because it was so big. There was no question that you're going to do the max on that. The difficulty becomes in evaluating the smaller incidents. And so you use some of these other topics on here to figure that out. Particularly, what kind of community are you in? What kind of media access is there? Here in Southwest Oregon, we're about as a self-contained media environment as you can get. We're 4 hours away from Portland. We're 4 hours away from Sacramento. Other than that, there's Medford. And so it's tough to get a lot of national attention here, a lot of regional attention here. And so that was one of the things that played into how the response went on the Big Windy fatality. Visibility is part of that. Obviously, in Yarnell, you were right next to Phoenix. Tucson was right down the road. LA was just over the border. There's a lot of visibility. There was a lot of media interest, and rightly so. It became a national and international story. So again, judging those smaller incidents is going to take a little bit of experience and a little bit of skill. But again, I think if you're going to err, you err on the more rather than the less. Geographic scope is pretty key too for both public affairs folks and PIOs. A few years ago, 2015, I was working in the regional office in Portland when the Twist River fatalities happened. And PNW2 was right down the road, but Twist River was not their fire, but they responded and they had to take over some of the responsibilities for that. And you can never tell how much or what's going to happen and how you'll be affected. It could be that you're a public affairs officer on a unit and something happens on another unit, but the closest hospital is on your unit. So how are you going to respond to that? How are you going to support that other unit? So any number of things can happen. Be prepared for it all. Multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional, state, local, federal, we're all in this together, and we need to help each other out. Now, the first reaction will always be to look close, but do your best to look out across time and space. And again, err on the side of more. Overreactions are always preferable. You can always say, hey, yeah, we didn't really need those resources in retrospect. It's much harder to say, man, we should have gotten those resources. That's a much tougher conversation to have. Next slide. So here's an example of the geographic question. For Iron 44, helicopter went down in Northern California in the Shasta Trinity National Forest. At the time, the Shasta Trinity had a huge number of fires going on, a huge number of teams on their forest. They brought in the Atlanta Nemo team to deal with the accident scene and the investigation and take the load off the forest. And because the forest was so overwhelmed and the direction to Atlanta Nemo was somewhat narrow, we were sitting over here in Medford on the Rogue River Siskiyou and Medford BLM thinking, hey, a lot of the folks who died are in the hospital from that accident are from the Medford area, and we're going to soon have to have a pretty big memorial service and deal with some families. But because of the focus on the Shasta Trinity, where they were concerned about their forest, and rightly so, it was really tough. We were not able to order people. We couldn't buy things. We couldn't really do any kind of take any kind of action except to plan. And it took 2 or 3 days before the folks in California realized, oh, yeah, we've got a lot of things going on in Medford. And then we finally got a Portland Nemo team minus the incident commander, who started putting some meat on the bones of the memorial service and working with families. So we're able to do that. In the meantime, the pilot on the helicopter was from Eastern Oregon. So the Wallowa Whitman National Forest was involved in that. Forest supervisor was on the notification team that went to the house and told the family. And then they had a memorial service too. So for Iron 44, we had 2 regions, 3 forests, 1 BLM district, 1 2/3 NEMO teams, and a lot of confusion initially. And I put up this little badly drawn PowerPoint chart that I did to simply show that no organization on an incident within an incident on a fatality will look the same. It may take some time to figure out all the impacts and the reach and scope. It'll take time to build the organization. It'll take time to tweak it for effectiveness. But remember that people are almost always operating with the best of intentions. You try to stay true to your ICS principles, but because the incident is defined by people and emotions, it will never be as clearly defined as a fire or other non-fatality, non-accident kind of incident. So always remember to ask what other places are touched by your incident. And don't just think agency. It could be hometowns. It could be universities where this person who just graduated and is now on their first job, just left. There could be any number of things. So don't just get caught up in thinking about agencies. Think about look at the lives of people and figure out if that's going to come into play. All right, next slide, please. So pause there again for a round of questions. I'll turn it over to Kale.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jim. Appreciate that. We do have a note from Holly in the chat there for some PAOs to consider. And for those PAOs who might not be able to see it, consider asking your forest unit FMO or others to partner with you on a Type 3 wildfire sim, including an input of a COVID-19 positive by a local resource assigned to the fire, or just the rumor of a resource being tested at the local health department, and then plan to conduct the sim and AAR within the next 2 weeks. So big consideration there for public affairs officers. We'll open it up to questions. We do want to make sure that the questions are for the good of the whole group. And I did see John Miller's hand up there, so let's start with John.
Okay, can you hear me now?
You bet, John, go ahead.
This is just for the PAOs, don't ever underestimate that something can happen where you work at any time. I often wondered about dealing with fatalities, and unfortunately in 2006, we had an engine burnover. And I very quickly learned how to deal with a multi-fatality incident. Having a good list as a PAO of experienced people that know how to deal with these things and PIOs is critical, and also having a plan. Steve Ryan from FDNY and I were on an incident last year where we were supporting another team, and there was a serious incident on this forest, and the team had this excellent incident with an incident plan, but what was missing was a strong plan between the team information section and the public affairs officer. So it's like, okay, this we had a firefighter that was struck by a tree. And so we kicked the plan in, and unfortunately, because I've dealt with a lot of bad things over the years, it's like, okay, this needs to happen, this needs to happen, this needs to happen. And I'm talking to the public affairs officer, and their transmission is stuck like in first gear. And it was clear to me, it's like, this should have been something ironed out right after the in brief as to, okay, if something bad happens, how are we going to engage with each other? Here's our plan. What do you want me or one of my peers in the information section to do to support the forest. And so for me personally, after many, many moons going to fires, it was like this kind of wake up reminder of, gang, I gotta, I kind of slipped there. Fortunately, it played out for the best, for the individual that was struck with a tree. But anyways, that was just something I wanted to share. This particular module is really near and dear to my heart, and it was, because I spent a number of years on the honor guard. Thank you.
Hey, I am a new lead this year, and the team that I am working with, of course, I've read their IWI, and it takes the PIO out of a core leadership position and puts the PIO in a wait until the IC tells you what to do position. And so given that, and not having been through an IWI as a lead before, my plan is to know the steps well presented in the incident within the PIO incident organizer, and then to prearrange with some folks who have more experience, the opportunity to have them on speed dial if necessary. So that's the way that I'm approaching preparing, in addition to participating in this training. And I would love it if somebody could comment at the appropriate time on whether that sounds like a good way to address it. Are there things that I'm overlooking that I should be doing?
All right. So first of all, you should be in the room, and you should be in the decision-making process. All of the functions are there in the incident command system for a reason. And the idea that public information would not be part of that decision-making process is anathema to me. You should be there. One experience I had when we had a serious injury on a fire many years ago was a situation quite like yours, where the information was not shared within the team very well. And so what happened was the information was shared with the agency administrator, who then shared it with their public affairs person. And the public affairs person went off and released some information that should not have been released. So if you find yourself on a team with that kind of tension and conflict, make sure you are really tied in with that public affairs person on the home unit or the host unit to make sure that you guys are communicating, so that you don't have any issues like had on that fire. And again, just stay aligned and do the best you can, and be annoying. And if you need help or assistance or guidance, you have a whole cadre of folks here, and probably a heck of a lot of people who are listening in and dialed in today who will help you when the time comes.
Thanks, Jim.
Great. Thanks so much, Meg. Thanks, Jim. Powerful answer, and honest as well.
So far, we've talked about stress, and we've talked about managing and planning and staffing. And so now what I want to do is talk about some of the specific communication issues that will arise when you have particularly a serious accident and fatality, or now maybe some COVID-19 issues. The first one is hindsight bias. And that's the effect of knowing that an outcome has occurred on our estimate of how likely that outcome was. It makes us believe that events that have happened were potentially foreseeable. And this is a great slide, because what it captures is you can assume that, let's assume that the person on the left with the big balloon is a firefighter, and they're seeing all these things, and they're getting all these inputs in real time, and their environment is complex, it's dynamic, the outcome is uncertain. They're doing all the calculus in their heads, they're doing all the geometry, they're figuring things out, they're trying to figure out the best path to go with all of these inputs, and they're doing this under the stress of compressed time and probably the stress of a lot of other things, like trying to look after their crew, trying to accomplish their mission, protect the community, that kind of stuff. And then something happens. As soon as something happens, we lose a lot of that context because we cannot look before the accident. The fact that the accident happens colors everything and every thought that we have about that accident. You can't not see it. So afterwards, the outcome is known. And what we tend to do as humans is we try to look for a simplified answer. We try to make sense of things as quickly as we can. And so instead of it being complex and dynamic, it becomes simplified, it becomes static, it becomes linear. And that's a pretty good quote up top. The future seems implausible before an accident, but after the accident, the past seems incredible. You cannot look at an accident without knowing something happened. And as people around you try to make sense of what happened, that hindsight bias will come out in that drive for a narrative. They will seek refuge in the linear and the simplified. And it's just a natural human reaction. They're not doing it out of any animosity or anything. It's just natural. So we have to be really careful about the environment we're working in as communicators after an accident, because we're going to be hearing a lot of that. And if we start to communicate that way, it's very easy to lapse into an unintentional blaming the victim mode, even if it's very subtle. So what we need to do as communicators is respect the complexities and the stresses that people are under and let the investigations proceed. We don't want to dishonor folks, and we don't want to disrespect their families. And, one of the key identifiers of hindsight is if people are talking and they start off a sentence with "if only," or "if they would have," or "if they could have," that's hindsight talking. And so again, it's very easy to unconsciously bring that into our discussion, our responses, but try to recognize it and try to stay as objective as you possibly can. Because again, we don't want to get in that position where we're casting doubt on the people who went through that experience. Another, next slide, please. One that's related is confirmation, and that's where you have a tendency to seek out and assign more weight to evidence that confirms your hypothesis and ignore or underweigh evidence that could discredit your own hypothesis. And so, for instance, if I took the opinion that air tankers aren't really that important to wildland firefighting and are a waste of resources, I might show you this slide, this photo, because in this photo, down on the right side, right where the ground and the smoke meet, there's a little sliver of pixels that's an air tanker. And I can say, hey, this air tanker is not effective. It's not doing the job. It's not stopping the fire. Therefore, why waste resources on it? What I'm not showing you are the photos that show air tankers doing a good job. And so that confirmation bias is coming out in the photos that I've selected for this slide. Not that I actually think air tankers are worthless and all that stuff. This is just an example. So that confirmation bias and that hindsight bias can also come from questions too, particularly from reporters who are trying to, again, simplify things for their readers or viewers, create that narrative that makes sense and tells a story, and that story may not be there to be told quite yet. Next slide. Third bias I want to talk about is cause. All cause is constructed. It's not something waiting out there to be discovered by accident investigators, says one of the the most famous people who talks about accidents and cause, Sidney Dekker. When dealing with human decisions, cause is always constructed. Even when dealing with mechanical issues, cause gets constructed. If you think about the first slide on hindsight bias, all of the inputs and all of the decisions that were going through that person's head before the accident, we can never recreate that. And so we cannot definitively say that this is a cause because we can't recreate the conditions that led to the accident or that were before the accident. So even when dealing with mechanical issues, again, cause gets constructed. You know, the O-rings got cold and failed to seal properly on the space shuttle. Chernobyl happened because of the graphite-tipped control rods. Well, those are causes, I guess, but are they the real causes of those accidents? The tendency for cause is, again, towards simplification and personal at the expense of the systemic. So cause is influenced by hindsight and confirmation bias. If you're looking for mechanical failure or human failure, you'll probably find it. So again, we have to be careful when talking about cause, particularly those events that lead to injury or death. And in the immediate and near term, right after something's happened, that's when folks will be most adamant about identifying causes. And again, that's just a human reaction. You know, why did the bear cross the river? Well, we can't talk to the bear. We don't know why the bear crossed the river. The only rationale we can create for why the bear crossed the river is one that we assume, one that we make up. Now, this is all a huge problem for communicators because we want to be fair to the people who experience the critical incident. But if we pay attention to hindsight, confirmation, and cause biases, it's really tough to overcome, in large part because if you're aware of those biases, your statements will be unsatisfactory to most people and maybe even yourself. The need for an answer, a cause, is sometimes overwhelming, often overwhelming. And we just don't feel right sometimes when we can't say or identify a cause, or when we can't build a narrative around a very complex and emotional topic such as a fatality. Next slide. So here are a few communication watchouts. Confirming negatives. I mentioned Big Windy earlier, and how we were ready to go at 8 a.m., but the official notification and public announcement didn't happen until much later in the afternoon. And as a result, we started getting phone calls from people who had loved ones working on that fire. And the tendency would be when they would say, oh, well, can you just tell me if Crew 6 was involved? The tendency is to say, no, Crew 6 is fine, you're good. But you can't do that, because what if somebody who is in the family of the person who died calls? You can't confirm that negative. You can't say, no, they weren't involved. And so that leads to some awkwardness. And then you can also, if you start confirming negatives, people can figure things out by the process of elimination. So it's best just to say, hey, we're still investigating things. We don't have a definitive statement right now. As soon as we're able, we'll let you know. But again, confirming negatives, tempting, seems kind of natural, but be wary of that. Releasing information outside of approved channels, even if it's to other incident or agency personnel. Your incident within an incident plan, your agency administrator's guide, your protocols in both the agency and the team should all address this. And if you tell someone, even if they're a trusted someone, they're under no obligation to follow your rules, but you'll be responsible for their actions. So it doesn't matter if it's a mentor, doesn't matter if it's your old boss or whoever, you stick to the processes that your group has for releasing the information. And as long as you do that, you'll be okay. Comparisons. You can't compare one thing without elevating it over another. And particularly with fatalities, we do not want to make comparisons. If a reporter says, okay, is Yarnell the worst fire ever? I'm not going to answer that in the affirmative or the negative. I'm not going to acknowledge that comparison, because as soon as I do, if I say, hey, yeah, of course, Yarnell's the worst because 19 firefighters died from the same crew, that immediately diminishes the experience that the parents of the kids who died on Iron 44 have, because to them, Iron 44 was and always will be the worst fire ever. And we don't want to diminish people's experiences. So do not fall into the trap of comparisons. It's okay, I think, to probably work with things up to a point. Like you can say, oh, this is the second largest fire in Oregon by acres. But once you start talking about lives and values and things like that, stay away from those kinds of comparisons. Again, don't diminish other people's experiences by providing an official statement from an official place. That's not a good thing that we want to do, I think. Releasing sensitive information like the precise location of a fatality is a very gray area. At Yarnell, there were a lot of media that wanted to know exactly where the burnover site was. And it didn't feel right to talk about that, even though it wasn't necessarily protected information or sensitive information. Well, it was sensitive, but it wasn't legally sensitive, legally protected. So one of the things I did, and whether this is right or wrong, I'm not sure, but it felt right at the time, was to intentionally not learn where that location was. So I could tell media that I don't know where that is. And what we did was we waited until the folks up in Prescott, where the Granite Mountain home base was, where the Prescott Fire Department was, we waited for them to release that. And then we started talking about it on the incident down in Yarnell. So some of those things are really tricky. Use your best judgment. Have a rationale in case you have to explain it. But really pay attention. You know, one of the things about particularly fatalities is that you have to think through all of your answers. You have to think through every question, because a lot of times the question will sound innocuous, but it's really not. And you have to put it in that context. And so it takes a lot of mental energy to work a fatality, and particularly to address media and family members and those kinds of audiences on those kinds of topics. So be careful with that. Lack of coordination and defined roles between the agency administrator, the IC, the PIO, the PAO. You have to have those things nailed down. If not, it leads to confusion. It leads to actions that are counterproductive. You don't want to have one group coming in and cleaning up the mess of another group because you initially couldn't communicate correctly, or you didn't share the right information, or you assumed that those words meant something and the person presenting them actually meant something different. So pay attention to all of your communications, make sure everything's lined out, and make sure you work together on these things. And again, that tension between the roles of the PIO and the PAO is often reflected in a tension between the incident management team and the agency when you have a critical incident. So be aware of that. And again, communication is the key. That's the best medicine we have for that problem. And then again, official notifications being preceded by social media. I mentioned earlier that we have notification system built in the mid 20th century. I think the best we can do is the best we can do. We are going to show up. We are going to make official notifications, even if the family's heard about it by social media hours beforehand. Obviously in Yarnell, it would have been impossible for any of our agencies to get together 19 notification groups and go track down 19 families and tell them before any of the news media or social media had the story. So I think one of the things we have to do as a public affairs officer in particular is get together with your fire staff, get together with your your manager and say, hey, let's make sure that our firefighters and our employees know, excuse me, that if something bad happens, that we are going to be there. We're going to go to their families. We're going to go to their homes, but we may not get there before they learn about it, but we are coming. I think that's a pretty key thing that we have to do these days. All right, next slide. So I stole this slide from Chris's initial presentation on the first class. And again, just a reminder that as I move into the COVID-19 discussion now, that we have a wildland fire response plan that was put together by the Northwest Geographic Area, and the Northwest Incident Management teams also put together some best practices. And next slide. And this is just a reminder, another slide I stole from Chris from his earlier presentation, is to make sure you're staying aligned with your information. COVID-19 is going to be quite a bit different from our normal experiences, and we have to be aligned. And I like that Chris used the word aligned in his presentation, because typically in the PIO world, we always hear stay in your lane, but that gets really fuzzy. Those lanes get fuzzy. But as long as we're staying aligned on COVID-19, as long as we're talking off the same page, we can talk in our own voice, we can do the things we need to do, but we know we're not going to get way out of whack. PIO Bulletin Board has some good stuff on incident within an incident and what to do and how to do it. And I think that there are some folks, including our folks now, who are working on putting some COVID-19 information and bullets into those plans. All right, next slide. So complexity factors for COVID-19. This ties in with the sense-making slide earlier and Chris's risk discussion yesterday. Look at your local population, local number of cases. Healthcare capacity is going to be key this year. I'm not sure that we can do complexity analysis for wildland fire without including that local healthcare capacity. Screening and testing frequency, and know that there are differences between screening and testing. Screening is, hey, do you have a temperature? Hey, have you been doing some at-risk behavior lately? You've been coughing, that kind of thing. Testing is getting the real test done and seeing if you have the virus or if you have the antibodies. Social distancing and mask, it's going to be key. What I think it sounds like is going on in Arizona is if there's a positive case, they'll do the contact tracing. And if they get to somebody who had a mask on when that contact was made, then that contact trace stops at that point. Otherwise, it keeps going. So we're going to have to pay attention to mask this year, and that's going to be probably a major requirement on incidents. And we may be in states where it's absolutely required too. Duration of incident and number of personnel. Obviously, those are key factors. The longer it goes, the more people you have, the more likely you're going to have some kind of exposure to firefighters. And then finally, I'll add partisanship. There's a lot going on in our country right now that makes it easy for people to look at just about everything through a partisan lens. And as a PIO, be aware of your surroundings. Be aware of where you send your staff. Don't assume that because you worked a fire in that community 5 years ago, that community is still the same. And be aware of the skills and abilities the PIOs or PAOs have to deal with difficult encounters. I hope that information officers ensure your communications, be they official radios, cell text, etc., are rock solid. We need to make sure that we are in communication with all of the information officers working on that incident. And we want thorough coverage for the PIO geographic span. And that's not just the incident, right? If some folks are working remotely in the next town over, some people are doing some physical trap line work in the next county, we need to make sure our communications extend to cover those folks. Let me also mention mental fatigue. And it sounds like this is affecting the Arizona fires too. Firefighters spend their mental energy on the line like they've been trained to do. But then when they get off the line with COVID-19, they have to engage and stay alert to do the simple things like get food, get a shower, get supplies. There's less downtime for our firefighters. And by extension, that's going to be for us, for the incident management team, the support staff, everybody who works to help the firefighters out. And all of that may have repercussions later this year in the form of fatigue, both mental and physical. And that, of course, may lead to less than robust decision making. And again, there's that idea of COVID-19 kind of being saturating everything we do and changing all of our processes and being a constant prick in the back of our brain. We know COVID is out there and we know it's going to be moving around on our incidents. We know people will get it. We know some people will have to isolate. We know some crews will have to go down. That's a given, I think. And while things are still new right now, after the first few times we deal with a positive case or isolations, it'll start to become, I think, for lack of a better word, routine. And we'll learn how to deal with it a little bit better each time. However, all COVID-19 incident-related hospitalizations and fatalities will always be a critical incident. And so we have to be prepared for that this year. And I hope that by thinking through some of these other issues that we've learned from past fatalities and serious accidents, that will help us work through some of the COVID-19 issues. Next slide. Some things to think about and plan for, but not necessarily solve right now. These are a few possibilities. Individual or small number of firefighters test positive and sent home. Individual or small number of firefighters test positive and are quarantined or hospitalized locally. Entire crew isolates at home unit or at incident. Multiple crews isolate. As a public affairs officer, what might you be expected to do if firefighters from your own unit test positive, either on your home unit or away from your home unit on a different kind of assignment? Do you have a good plan? Are you aligned with the public health folks? How would you support another unit and potentially numerous families if a unit from outside your home unit were isolated in your area? Do you have the capacity? Again, check that agency administrator's guide. Make sure your management, your leadership team is working together and understand that this is these kinds of things are a very likely scenario in the coming months. Next slide. Some more scenarios. All incident personnel are isolated. We're going to quarantine a whole camp here. We overwhelm local public health and healthcare resources. Positive cases come from a previous incident, and contact tracing is now following up and catching folks on your incident. Positive cases result from travel through certain states and localities, result from specific actions on an incident or home unit. So for PIOs, a few questions. How can you talk about exposures on other fires and maintain that your fire is different? How do you talk about the safety and the mitigating actions you're taking when you're catching some cases from previous fires? How do we diplomatically talk about hotspots if they start to influence resource availability or strategy and tactics? And the questions go on. Again, these are not only likely, but probable scenarios, I think, this year. And again, if we get to that point where we have hospitalizations and or fatalities, that kicks it into a whole different gear. And the issue is going to be, if that happens, or how much of it's going to happen, and how overwhelming is it going to be for not only the unit that's experiencing it, but the region, the wildland fire community, the agency, as we try to deal with that and maybe different things happening in different places across the West. Next slide. Some more scenarios. One of the questions is, will public health folks advise against a large number of resources coming from all over the place going into certain areas that may not have very high rates or may be hotspots and don't want to add to it. How do we manage the public health concerns with the wildland fire concerns? I can certainly see instances where destructive fire is blamed on fire officials and agency officials caring more about COVID-19 than protecting lives and property. I'm not saying that is a true thing. I'm saying that's a rumor that could get started very easily and we'll have to deal with. There have already been several public pronouncements about how there'll be a greater reliance on aircraft for initial attack. And as we know, if something goes wrong with an aircraft, it is more than likely going to be catastrophic in some form or fashion. And so if we have a greater reliance on aircraft for initial attack and we have an aviation accident, what kind of questions is that going to create? Are we transferring risk because of COVID-19? A lack of resources, unwillingness to expose firefighters to direct smoke. Some of those things could easily, in the public eye, be looked at and blamed for extensive smoke intrusions into communities and the resulting health effects on the populace. Again, smoke is likely going to be a larger threat than flames this year for many people, and we do not have a good answer for that. And again, these scenarios are not to solve, but to inform your planning and preparation. You'll never get to every scenario, and if you try, you'll get wrapped around the axle very quickly. But we can prepare for the currently probable and likely incidents, which in the case of an extreme incident will help us work through that as we need to. And again, the act of planning is more important than the plan itself. And we do need to plan. As I mentioned, in Arizona, there are crews right now that are out of service because they're having to isolate. It is a certainty that COVID-19 will be on our incident, and how much it will affect our Northwest incidents remains to be seen. But as the public-facing arm of the incident or the agency PIOs and PAOs, all again need to be prepared. Next slide. So a few conclusions. I keep harping on it, but the more you plan and prepare, the more you can reduce the stress from figuring out how to respond. The more slides you have in your head, the easier it's going to be. Be honest with yourself, do that self-evaluation, particularly if a bad day occurs. Take care of yourself, ask for help. If you ask for help, you're almost certainly going to get it from somewhere. It may be a phone call, it may be a person showing up, but some kind of help is going to come. You just have to ask. Next slide. And that goes into the idea that you're never alone. We're all in this together. And again, someone is always going to be there. Now, we've never had a modern fire year, one influenced by climate change in the middle of a pandemic. The guys in 1918 didn't leave us a lot of lessons learned. We're supposed to be all risk, but let's be honest, most of our mental slides are from fires, with not many from global pandemics or public health issues. But I think we will make it through. We're going to learn on the way, and the end of the fire year will be smoother than the beginning, which is where we're at now. Really pay attention to your mental fatigue. We can't rely on experience as much as we have in the past, and so we'll have to think things through, figure things out. That takes time, that takes energy. Don't let yourself get to day 4, day 6, and have this sudden realization that you can't mentally or intellectually engage anymore. Take care of yourself. It's going to be a bumpy ride. I think it's really important, particularly in this year, to ask yourself, what am I in service to? What's my reason for doing this work that is full of uncertainty and can turn tragic in a heartbeat? If it's not something larger than yourself, it's going to be a tough year for you. And that goes, again, back to that thing of being honest with yourself, find that higher calling. I think that gives you the strength to deal with some of the uncertainty and issues that are going to come this year. This is not going to be a satisfactory year for many people, and probably not for us either. So rely on each other, pay attention to your health, and we'll do the best we can, and we'll be better at it as we go along. And if this is still going on next year, we'll be quite a bit better at it. So next slide. Thank you for your time. And I appreciate so many people tuning in. Saw a lot of very familiar and friendly names. So hello to all of you. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
I do have a special guest who has gone through COVID this year. Steve Ryan is on from NYFD. And I've asked Steve to just give a few words, turn his camera on, and explain kind of the emotional impact of having his brothers and sisters on NYFD impacted by COVID. Steve?
Hey, Kale, thanks. I may not be able to turn the camera on because Mrs. Ron would be very upset with the cleanliness of the house right now. But as Kale said, we had, obviously New York City was inundated. They activated our team early on, the FDNY's IMT, and we were basically responsible for the purchasing, the receiving, and the ordering and distribution of all EMS supplies as a result of COVID to all firehouses and EMS stations throughout the city. In terms of members, we had just under 5,000 members COVID positive in the city, including civilians. We have roughly 16 to 18, I think it's 18,000 members in the New York City Fire Department. So about a quarter of our workforce had gone out sick with COVID-19, and we lost 11 members of the department. So 7 civilians and 4 EMS members had all passed away. What we did while we were out, again, we were very much responsible for the distribution, and we had an internal document that wound up becoming external that we put out an update every day, just listing different things. A lot of it had to do with departmental changes that we kind of did. And in that, we listed all the members. What we would do is, because we feared that the amount of membership was going to increase in terms of deaths of COVID-19, and we're very, very happy and lucky that that number stayed at 11. We would list that member for one day, and then the department puts out other material. The issue that we have usually when we're in city, working within city, is that we have our own Department of Public Affairs that deals with a lot of their own stuff, and then we kind of help them as it goes. If we go out as a team to another area of this country, we have a lot more carte blanche to do, and that's just unfortunately the way it kind of is. But I really loved hearing what you had to say, and the information is great. Line of duty deaths, unfortunately, and it is unfortunate, we deal with them tremendous amount. The IMT does do a lot of helping and assisting with the line of duty deaths for the job. We have a ceremonial that is phenomenal. The only thing that I can think of maybe in terms of, and I think you touched on it, I'm pretty sure, in terms of COVID or anything COVID related, out of those 5,000, just under 5,000 members that we had sick, a lot of them were in shape, middle-aged, no underlying health issues, so they weren't really that sick. To them, it was just like a flu. It was a little bit more serious than a flu, and we're very happy with that. We did have members that were hospitalized and on ventilators that did recover, so we're very, very happy with that also. But in terms of going through operational periods, so if PNW 2 is on an incident, maybe somebody did go on a ventilator and now they're being relieved by the Southwest team or something like that. Maybe just that transfer of information is critical, I would assume, because the new team coming in really needs to know what was going on in that incident, in terms from one team to the next, because that member or that firefighter or employee of that fire may unfortunately succumb to their injuries of COVID, but it may be a few weeks later. So really kind of understanding that transfer of information, and I think you touched on it, it's huge. I would assume that's probably the biggest thing, especially for right now. We lucked out with New York City. We have firehouses and EMS stations. We secluded and basically kept every firehouse secluded by themselves, so they weren't allowed to interact with other firehouses other than on scene. So we're very lucky with that. I think the wildfire, it's a tough situation out there because all these teams are coming and all these units are coming from everywhere, and they're always interacting with each other, and base camps are so massive. And I think it's a logistical nightmare that logs are going to have to deal with in terms of making smaller base camps and spike camps around to kind of segregate all these units away from each other so they're not all on top of each other at all times. But I give you guys credit and everything you guys do, and I'm lucky enough to come out hopefully once a year to learn from everybody, and everything you guys do is phenomenal, and I appreciate all the lessons that I've learned coming out to see you guys. And trust me, and Kale can attest, I brought tons of stuff back to New York City, and our PIO shop is running seamlessly, not seamlessly, but running significantly better because of all the lessons we learned from everybody all you folks that do it out west on a regular basis. And we really appreciate everything.
Wow, thanks, Steve. And I'll let Jim comment on that, but I do want to let folks know this was not pre-planned. I just put Steve on the spot with a text. So thanks so much, Steve, for that sharing. Jim?
Yeah, I think that's a great point about transitions, and that's going to be a key part of that PIO-PAO communication, because we want to have redundancy in that transition. So when a new team comes in, the PIO is going to debrief the person. The team is going to debrief the other team. But the public affairs officer, the agency administrator, are also going to mention those same things, so that that information is not lost in that transition at all. So that's just another emphasis for really improving and working on that communication between public affairs and public information. And I also want to thank FDNY for the lessons we've learned from them and the support they've given us. There's no way we could have pulled off the Yarnell Memorial Service without assistance from FDNY and without their vast experience and hard-earned experience. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Anything we can do to help, and I know the guys are, again, I know that the members that do that, the ceremony and everything like that for my job, goes out and helps other people because, and again, I always say, unfortunately, we've become very good at it. And it's a bad thing that we've become good at, but at least we try to make everything easier on the families. You spoke about liaison, stuff like that, and that's a huge thing to have a liaison. I can't stress that enough. It's a huge thing because the families have so many questions, and to have that one go-to person that literally stays with them at all times and can get the answers is a huge, huge benefit for the family that's grieving.
Oh, we always love hearing from you, Steve. Thank you so much. Okay, Rich Tyler, the mic is yours.
Awesome. First of all, I want to start off with saying thank you. Jim, great presentation. Really appreciate all that you brought to the conversation today, because really that's the baseline or foundation that we get to work from as we head into our wildfire season. Kale, Chris, Sarah, thank you, and everyone else who's been involved with setting this just-in-time training up for all of us. Really appreciate it. And as far as the Oregon State Fire Marshal's Office PIOs are concerned, if any of you end up in Oregon on a wildfire with us, most of the time we are in a unified kind of command structure. And just want to let you guys know that we're bringing our usual flexibility, adaptability, collaboration to work with the team, other team PAOs and PIOs. I know I'm a bit biased, but I think the PIO section is one of the most flexible sections anyway. So walking into this scenario this summer, we are ready and look forward to working with each and every one of you in the state of Oregon. So again, thanks for putting all this training together. Looking forward to next Wednesday.
Right on. Thanks, Rich. We appreciate that. And we did include the Oregon State Fire Marshal's best management practice in Appendix E, which is part of the Pacific Northwest PIO best management practices. So again, it takes all of us together. I know we've had Oregon Department of Forestry, Jamie Knight and other leads on here, and Washington DNR, and our whole mix of everybody makes this happen. So let's have one more question. I'll go ahead and give 15 seconds or look for a hand raised, and then we'll go into closing out. Okay, I'm really practicing that skill. That is the best practice. Holly Craig has been teaching us 16 seconds is a scientific number that allows enough room for people to fill the space if they have something in their mind. You can always email us. We put it in the PACE model there. If you have any follow-up questions for Jim, and Jim will hand it back to you for closing.
All right. Well, again, thank you all for listening. It's been an honor. And I'll close out with just one more watch out situation reflected in this photo, which is remember to talk to your audiences and not the map. And with that, I will ask if Chris or Sarah have any closing thoughts, and that will be it for me. Thanks.
Well, I'll just go ahead and say thank you to everybody who's been attending these.
Yeah, that was a really powerful presentation. So thanks for that, Jim. I know it was long when you're the only presenter. So we really appreciate that. I just wanted to say, if you have a question, because some of this can be kind of personal, and maybe you've gone through a situation before, like a fatality, and this season is definitely more stressful, and you just want to get some more one-on-one feedback. You all have Kale's email, so you can just reply back to him and talk to anyone on the cadre, and you could get our contact information. This is for the people that can't see the chat. I'm just thinking that, sometimes you need to have a little space to be able to maybe write down a question. So feel free to do that for anyone on the cadre, because we want to be able to support you. And of course, like Jim said, we're here to support you during when we, start getting into that busy fire season. But right now would be great because we all have a little bit more time to talk. So there's that. And then, I just wanted to say this is the time to get your name in for the simulation. We need the name so we can be able to build a good product. And also, if you have any ideas about what could be in the simulation. So that's all I have. Thanks so much for attending, and we'll see you next week, hopefully.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And on behalf of Holly Craig, she's in a meeting actually presenting how the training's going. And you'll get an email from us tomorrow morning that has all the summary of the last 3-4 classes with all the SharePoints, PowerPoints, and handouts. We want to make sure those are accessible, so you'll see that tomorrow. And again, thanks so much. We appreciate it. We'll go ahead and close it out here.